Welcome everybody. I'm Sean Healy. I'm the CEO in Social Justice Ireland, and we're delighted that you've joined us today for the launch of this report. I want to especially welcome Minister Joe O'Brien. He's the Minister with responsibility for community development and charities, and he's responsible for the whole area that we're covering in this report, public participation networks and all that sort of stuff. We'd also have a special welcome for Ciara Bates, who's the Principal Officer in the Department of Rural and Community Development, who will be responding to the report in due course. And then, most of all, of course, I want to welcome everybody who has joined us. We are already up at 132 people who are actually on the call. So welcome to each and every one of you who have joined us, and a special welcome for everybody linked to a PPN anywhere in the 31 local authorities, and then also a special welcome to local authority staff and local authority councillors who have joined us as well. So everybody's welcome is the basic point that I wanted to make. The programme for this hour and a quarter. I'll say a few more words, and then Minister Joe O'Brien will launch the report, and then Colette Bennett from Social Justice Ireland will outline the report. Ciara Bates, the Principal Officer from the department, will respond to the report, and we'll follow it up with a Q&A. And anybody who wants to can put in a question into the chat, and that will be. We'll try then to see how many of the questions we can cover in the time that actually we have available. So moving on to the report itself, I suppose Social Justice Ireland has always had a big interest in the whole area of deliberative democracy and improving people's participation. It's always been on our agenda for years and years. And so back in 2013, I was very glad to be invited to chair the working group that the Minister Hogan set up at that time to review citizens' engagement with local authorities. And that was the group that made the proposal to establish a public participation network in every local authority. And I think we forget these things, so it's good maybe just to mention the people who actually were on that working group, besides myself. Seamus Boland, Michael Ewing, Liam Keane, Deirdre Garvey, Robin Hannon, all of us from the community and voluntary sector, and then Sinead Carr from Tipperary Local Authority, and Sean McLaughlin from the department. And we were working in 2013 and produced the report that the Minister wanted by the end of that year. And it was a unanimous report. And so on the basis of that, PPNs were established, and on the basis of the fact that there's PPNs out there, this report that we're launching today looks at deliberative democracy within the PPN and the local authority process. And it's just the first of a number of studies that we propose to produce in the period ahead around this whole area that we think is very, very important, because we do think that whole thing of participation is critically important for the future. So, without any more introduction, it's my privilege to invite Minister Joe O'Brien to launch this report. So over to you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for everyone who's attending. I can't see many of your faces with the current setup, but I trust you, Sean, when you say there's a large number there.
It's just reached 140, as well as not including those of us on the screen.
Okay, well, that's impressive. Thank you everyone for coming along. And just initially to say thank you to Social Justice Ireland and in particular to Sean and Colette for the work that they've put into this report. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to the PPN stakeholders who responded to the survey that formed the basis for the report. It's always important to acknowledge, I think, that most respondents and indeed most PPN stakeholders are volunteers who work in their own time on behalf of volunteer-run groups that are members of the PPN. And the fact that they took the time from other commitments to respond to a survey of this nature, I think, is a great testament to their dedication to public participation at local and indeed national level. And as Sean sort of outlined there, Social Justice Ireland have a high level of experience with PPNs right from their very inception, when the framework for participation evolved from the working group on citizenship engagement. And Social Justice Ireland have continued, I suppose, to build good working relationships with PPNs. And the fact that the survey received, I think, 223 responses reflects that fact. I suppose the starting point of this report is the guidelines and the principles set out by the Council of Europe to facilitate greater participation by members of the public. And these principles are truly foundational to the mission of PPNs, as they are deeply rooted in the original report of the Working Group on Citizen Engagement with Local Government. That report back in 2014 was the founding document of the PPNs and recommended their establishment, as well as setting out the vision and structures underpinning them. And the report we are launching today has brought to light some very interesting findings, I think. And it's extremely positive to see that a clear majority of respondents agree that local authorities are actively encouraging participation by the PPN locally, and a majority regard decision-making processes in the local authority as open and accessible. They're significant findings, I think, that we could easily take for granted. Overall, a majority of the respondents also agree that the relationship between the local authority and the PPN is based on transparency, respect, and mutual reliability. I think this is a strong indicator that local authorities fundamentally embrace the PPN concept, and that PPN members are recognising this in turn. And I am also encouraged to see that the PPN stakeholders, by and large, agree that local authorities are facilitating a high level of participation when set against the Council of Europe's principles. Many respondents have agreed that their local authority is engaging in real dialogue with the PPN at different stages of the decision-making process. And the overall national picture that's portrayed in this report shows that PPNs are moving in a very positive direction where public participation is concerned. We have evidence, and it's always important, I think, to cite hard examples of the positive influence that PPNs can bring to the local decision-making process. And in particular, as an example from Kerry that I'd like to mention, where the County Council and the PPN collaborated to work towards a future where people with disabilities can fully participate in community life. Kerry PPN connected with the Disability Federation of Ireland and local access groups to hold a series of structured workshops to discuss the physical accessibility of spaces throughout the county. Following these workshops, they produced a report recommending actions that would improve the lives of those with disabilities. And this report has already had an effect on future planning. Kerry County Council has established a disability housing group, and Kerry PPN has representation on that group. And following the accessibility workshops, a member of a local group who has a visual impairment saw the importance and the impact of engaging with formal structures and stepped forward for a position on an SPC. And that's a real testament to, I think, to what PPNs can actually achieve. And the example clearly shows that by working in partnership, our local communities are the ones that can win. And it underlines, I think, the fact that decisions need to be reflective of the community for which they are made. And this is where we all want to be, and reviewing where we are gives us a pathway of getting there. That's not to say that there's more than one or two areas for improvements that have been highlighted in the report as well, and I'm conscious of that, and I'm not trying to gloss over that. Everything is far from perfect. Like, we note that some of the findings point towards areas for improvement in terms of the relationship between PPNs and the local authorities, and the implementation of a full partnership model of public participation. These findings will be taken on board and will be given serious consideration. In many respects, the timing of the publication report is very good, given that we are embarking on a review of PPN structures. This will be an independent root and branch review to ensure that PPN structures are fit for purpose and are truly enabling the PPN to live up to the ideals of participation in decision making. The review will consult directly with key stakeholders to give those directly involved with PPNs a say in their future. And from that perspective, I think this report that we're launching today serves a very useful function in collecting and documenting the views of the PPN stakeholders. I'm sure that all the PPN stakeholders will find the report's findings very valuable, The report is an insightful guide, I think, to how PPN stakeholders currently view our position, and when I say our position, Ireland's position within the participation dialogue structure. I think reviews of this nature, they give us an opportunity to take stock of where we are, to consider if we're all on the same page, and maybe there's a little bit of work to do there, but also to make sure that we have a common understanding of where we want to get to. And it allows us to see things from all perspectives as well and make the necessary adjustments so that we ultimately are all traveling in the same direction. And I think it also serves as a useful reminder of the core principles that underpin PPNs. And I really want to acknowledge the good work of all those who contributed to it. There isn't a meeting or a launch goes by these days where you have to reference really the reality that's all around us. And I think it's particularly important to do this in respect of PPNs. Last year and running into this year, and I suspect for a bit more of this year, there's going to be a particular challenge for PPNs. But I think importantly as well, and perhaps most importantly really, is that it's been an opportunity for them to shine, and they have proven their worth very much as well in terms of the response to COVID. They've played and continue to play an important role at local level in responding to COVID-19. They've been pivotal in organising the community response and meeting the needs of vulnerable people during a very difficult and uncertain time. And I wish to take this opportunity to really single PPNs out and their members, to thank them for that work and to applaud them for that work. Their collaboration with local authorities in the community response across the country really demonstrates the value of coming together and taking a shared approach, I think. And just to begin wrapping up, I mean, there are positive steps being taken, I think, to support the role of PPNs, and this is clearly demonstrated by the supports provided by my own department. The last time I spoke to many of you was towards the end of last year. We had the webinar on the PPN handbook and the launch of the annual report. And the recommendations from the annual report, the findings from this report today, and the outcome of the structural review will be very useful, I think, in terms of how we best support PPNs going into the future. And I think there's a very bright future for PPNs. And on that note as well, just to flag that there will be future opportunities on the way soon, I hope, for PPNs to engage in the whole area of climate action and climate justice. So watch this space, so to speak. But just finally, really just say thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and just to formally launch the Social Justice Ireland report, delivering deliberative democracy, participation by the public participation networks in local government decision making. And thank you all for coming today. I'm going to hang around for a little while, but I'll probably have to depart at around 10:30. But you're in very good hands with Ciara as well, and I'll touch base with Ciara after this meeting to see what kind of questions and comments came up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. That's really appreciated. And we fully understand the kind of pressures you're under, given the situation that the country is in and the various issues that have to be tackled so urgently, really. So thank you very, very much for being with us. Thank you also for your generous recognition of the role of volunteers, for the importance of community, for the need to build participation in decision making, and to look at, and your recognition of partnership and the role of the local authorities, crucial role of the local authorities, and the sort of many positive things that are there in the relationship between the PPNs and the local authorities, and also recognizing that there's still some distance to go. Nobody will be surprised at that. It's a relatively new structure, having only, like, the report was the end of 2013. The rollout started in 2014, and it's a pretty new operation, and still heading in now to a review of the structures and so on. So all in all, we'd be very happy and grateful for you launching it, and also for your generous comments on it. And we certainly hope to continue our engagement with it in Social Justice Ireland as well. So thank you, Minister. So now it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Colette Bennett from Social Justice Ireland, who will present the main findings of the report. Now, Colette is known to most, if not all of you, I suspect by all of you, and She has led this whole area of work for Social Justice Ireland in recent years, and she did the hard yards of actually collecting the data and putting it all together and actually writing the report as well. So over to you, Colette.
Probably unmute myself first. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much to the Minister for his very kind words. Absolutely, I know many of the names on the participants list, and it's great to have so many people tune in. So thank you all for that as well. I really appreciate it, again, particularly as so many of you are volunteers. I just want to give a bit of forewarning. There are two children who may alight upon me at any minute. I've set them a timer and told them not to bother me, but there's every possibility they'll ignore that in the time to come. So what I have is just a presentation basically on the findings. The report should be on our website, socialjustice.ie, and it will be emailed out to everybody in the list anyway. So just really to start off, if I can share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. So, you know, again, just to welcome everybody that's here. Now, sorry, there's something going on with my, okay. So Sean already gave a pretty good background in terms of how the PPNs came about, and they're really very firmly established now and recognised as the main conduit by which local authorities should engage with their communities. And there's a membership, as of the last annual report, of over 15,000 community organisations from the community and voluntary sector, the social inclusion sector, and the environmental sector. So that's a massive achievement in and of itself. The main way in which PPNs facilitate participation in local democracy is through the nomination and the election of representatives to local authority committees or boards. And that framework, the framework for that type of participation that was recommended by the working group that Sean mentioned, was the one that was identified by the Council of Europe. And that's the one which follows kind of a progression from least participatory to most participatory. And we will look at that in a little bit more detail. So just, I suppose, the purpose of this particular piece of research, and the Minister has probably already done this job for me, was to really capture how the various PPN stakeholders engaged in the participation processes and how they looked at it on the ground, how they view the applications of those principles that were set out by the Council of Europe framework to their participation, both in terms of overall and at each stage of the decision-making process. So just to have a look at what the framework is about. So it's based on essentially 4 principles. So you can see there, you know, it was aimed to address what the Council of Europe identified as one of the major concerns of modern democracies, and that was the alienation of citizens from the decision-making processes. So you can see here that the 4 principles that were set out to foster this constructive relationship between civil society and the decision makers were participation, trust, accountability and transparency, and independence. And as I mentioned in the report of the working group, these principles were very much fostered to be at the core of all governance participation processes. And they were then incorporated in part to be the principles and values of the PPNs, both in the very initial user guide and also brought across into the most recent iteration, into the handbook. So looking at, I suppose, the framework in itself and the level. So as I said, it goes from kind of the least to the most. So, you know, in looking at this, it's looking at, 2 interconnected dimensions. So the first dimension concerns the level of participation. So why, and then the second dimension sets out the steps in the decision-making process. So within the levels, you've got information, which again is the least, so that the information is given to people in civil society without any real major input. You then have consultation, which essentially speaks for itself, dialogue, and then partnership, which is your ultimate goal. It's your highest level of participation. We then look at stages in the decision-making process. So the framework sets these out as being the stages that are identified by the Council of Europe. So we look at agenda setting through drafting, decision-making, implementation, monitoring of those decisions, and then reformulation. So essentially, how are the outcomes of any of these policies and practices? How are they used? How are they put into action? So the various definitions that were set out by the Council of Europe were adapted for the purpose of our survey for the PPN. So to make it kind of more real in terms of the lived experience that stakeholders with the PPNs actually have. So just a little bit about the survey itself. It was developed by myself and Sean and reviewed by our Academic Advisory Council and an external researcher. This was then put on SurveyMonkey and it was circulated to all the PPN workers, and a huge thank you to them both for all of the work that they do, but also in terms of this piece of work as well. And we requested that they might circulate it to, all of their PPN Secretariat members, their representatives, and any local authority staff. We also sent that link to the CCMA and asked that they circulate it to local authority staff as well, because we really wanted to get the views of all stakeholders that are on the ground. So while we did look at reps and secretariat members and workers and local authority staff, we didn't canvass the views at this point for this piece of research of the department, either of the Department of Rural and Community Development or of the Department of, as it was then, Housing Planning and Local Government, because that was a more policy taking view. So we wanted the view on the ground. So a copy of the survey, which is appended to the report, that was launched in mid-June, so the 15th of June. And because we had so many people wanting to respond to it, we actually extended the deadline for responses to the 31st of August. So it was absolutely fantastic to see the level of interest that people took in it. And you can see here that the Minister mentioned the 223 unique responses. So you can see in terms of coverage of the local authority areas that we did have response from every local authority area. And, that's a real testament to your own dedication. We were absolutely delighted with it. We had, as I say, 223 complete and unique responses. We had cleaned down the data. We made sure, that it was properly, in terms of the responses that we had, that they were properly constituted. So we have at least one response from all local authority areas. And looking at that data, you can see that we have more responses from some areas than others. And it might be reasonable to assume at this stage that, some kind of skewing of the data or some kind of over-influence. I can tell you now, we took pains to make sure that wasn't the case. We extracted some of the larger to see if it made a significant impact on the outcomes, and it didn't. So we did validate the results that we have in that way to make sure that there wasn't a particularly positive or a particularly negative experience influencing the overall outcomes. In terms then of the actual stakeholders, so looking at this here, this is the breakdown per stakeholder group. So in terms of PPN workers, they include resource workers or support workers. PPN Secretariat only refers to a respondent who is a representative of a member group on the Secretariat, but not on any other committee or group. PPN representatives on SPCs, local community development committees, joint policing committees, they're all of those PPN reps on those statutory policy committees, and I suppose that's fairly self-explanatory. The other reps are those who might represent the PPN on a range of other committees or boards, so tourism boards, the regional drug and alcohol task forces, or some steering committees of local groups. Local authority staff is pretty self-explanatory. They're local authority staff with a particular link to either the community area or the PPNs. And then the four other respondents consist of members of, PPN member groups and one elected official. So again, huge thanks to everybody. So you can see here that almost 27% of the respondents were SPC reps. Just over 16% for Secretariat members. We had almost 14% from the LCDC. almost 12% from local authority staff. And again, huge thanks to them for inputting. 11% were PPN workers, just over 9 were JPC reps, and 9 were the other types of reps. Now, so getting down to, I suppose, the actual findings. First of all, we considered those principles that we talked about from the Council of Europe's document. And the first principle there is participation, which is probably the most kind of relevant to mind. To gauge this and to really measure this, we asked respondents to consider the statement, the local authority actively encourages participation by the PPN. And what's shown here is the chart of the proportion of response by stakeholder group. So you can see that a very high proportion of respondents, 77.1% in fact, either strongly agreed or agreed with this statement. Where there was disagreement, these tended to be in the kind of 10 to 20% mark across most stakeholder groups. Proportionally, and it might be expected, local authority staff were most likely to strongly agree with this statement. And that's a really good thing. So a lot of agreement in terms of the openness and the encouragement by local authorities in relation to participation. Moving on then to statement 2. So we looked at the principles of trust, accountability and transparency. And they're so interrelated that we found that the responses to statements 2, 3 and 4 could probably be read together. But for the purpose of statement 2, what we sought to measure there is how open and accessible the respondents felt the decision-making processes were as a whole. Statement 3 then concerns the respondents' view on the level of transparency in their dealings with each other. And then statement 4, we asked about accountability between the local authority and the PPN. So for statement 2, we asked respondents to consider the statement, the decision-making processes in the local authorities are open and accessible. So you can see here that while a majority of respondent groups either strongly agreed or agreed again, it was a lower level than with the previous statement at 57.9%. So this indicates that while respondents feel that participation is encouraged by local authorities, it may not extend to participation in local decision-making processes. So that there is that kind of that nuance to it. So the right sentiment essentially is there, but putting it into practice might be a slightly bigger challenge or a different issue. Moving on then to statement 3, we asked respondents to consider the statement that the relationship between the local authority and the PPN is based on transparency, respect, and mutual reliability. And again, the majority of respondent groups either strongly agreed or agreed with this statement, with more than 2 in 5 of local authority staff respondents strongly agreeing. Statement 4 then, and again, we're still on the principles around participation. It's a very similar picture here than was in the previous statements there. Here we asked respondents to consider the statement, the local authority and the PPN act openly, responsibly, clearly and accountably in their dealings with each other. And again, a majority either strongly agreed or agreed with this statement, but there was a significant amount of dissent among representatives, as you can see in this chart. And then the final statement in relation to principles considered the independence. So here we asked respondents to consider the statement that the PPN can act independently of the local authority and advocate different positions to those of the local authority. Now, it's interesting in that more than 4 out of 5 respondents agreed with this statement. You can see across the stakeholder groups, with the notable exception of the JPC reps, almost half of which disagreed with that statement. So you're already starting at the principal stage to see variances across even different types of PPN stakeholders groups. Now, as I said earlier, the Council of Europe identifies 6 steps in the decision-making process. So agenda setting, drafting decisions, implementation, monitoring and reformulation. And we assigned definitions to each of these that fit with the work of the local authority and which the PPN stakeholders would be familiar with. So in terms of agenda setting, that was setting the agenda for meetings for the new year or for the 5-year term of office. For drafting, it was writing local authority policies and procedures, community development plans and other policy documents of relevance to the community. In terms of decision, it was about the process of decision making about a policy or a procedure. On the implementation, we defined it as putting that policy into practice. On the monitoring side, we looked at monitoring and assessing the outcomes of the policy or the procedure. And then on reformulation, as I said, using the information that's gathered in that monitoring step to evaluate and reformulate policies or procedures. For each of those then, we looked at the Council of Europe model on participation and for each step, again, using definitions that the PPN stakeholders would identify with. So for information, we defined it as the local authority deciding or doing everything and informing the PPN afterwards. It's the very lowest level of participation. In terms then of consultation, that the local authority requests inputs from the PPN on certain areas selected by the local authority. In terms of dialogue, we defined it as the local authority retaining control of the process, but allowing the PPN to suggest some inputs. And then finally, in relation to partnership, that the local authority and the PPN collaborate in all aspects of this process. So we asked for each, we had that definition statement for each step in the decision-making process. So for the first one on agenda setting, you can see here in terms of the responses that they vary somewhat depending on the group involved. So more than a quarter of SPC reps and almost 1/4 of PPN workers and JPC reps and 1 in 5 of the Secretariat members, LCD reps and other reps felt that the PPN were just presented with information, that it was the lowest level they were at information stage when it comes to setting the agenda, compared to just 7.7% of local authority staff who felt that way. At the other end of the participation stages, we see that almost 1 in 5 of the PPN Secretariat only respondents and 16% of the LCDC reps and 15.4% of the local authority staff respondents felt that they set the agenda in partnership, compared to just 8% of the workers. So the majority of respondents felt that participation in this part of the decision-making process was somewhere in the middle. About 60% of the other PPN reps felt that local authorities controlled the process but allowed PPNs to input, so that kind of dialogue stage, as did almost half of the SPC representatives. And more than 2 in 5 of both the JPC reps and the local authority staff. This compares to just 22.6% of the LCDC reps who were more likely to respond that the local authority requested inputs on areas they selected. So they were at the consultation stage there. Moving on then to the drafting stage, we see a similar pattern of responses here to those that were provided in relation to agenda setting. Almost 14% of the Secretariat respondents felt that there was partnership in this stage of the process, as did almost 12% of the SPC reps and 11% of the local authority staff. 1 in 10 of the other representatives and the LCDC and the JPC reps also responded that drafting was undertaken in partnership between the local authority and the PPN. So that compares with the PPN worker respondents who felt that partnership was, 4% of whom felt that this was a partnership level. A higher proportion of most stakeholder groups felt that PPNs were at the dialogue stage again in terms of participation when it came to drafting policies, with half of the SPC and the local authority staff respondents and 45% of LCDC respondents feeling this way. The exceptions here were the PPN workers and the PPN representatives, the other PPN representatives, with over half of those responding that they felt the decision-making process was at consultation stage. You can see here there's still a significant level of respondents who felt that the PPN across the stakeholder groups were still at information level. So there is still some work to be done. On the decision making, respondents were asked to consider the level of participation in relation to policies or procedures. The stakeholder group most likely to respond that this stage of the process was conducted in partnership was local authority staff, and 19.2% responded in that way. This was followed by the Secretariat with 16%. Similar to the previous steps that we've seen in the decision-making process, a higher proportion of most stakeholder groups responded that the PPNs were at a dialogue stage. So 57.7% of local authority staff and 57% of the JPC respondents, and more than 2 in 5 of LCDC and Secretariat and SPC reps gave that kind of response. So again, you know, it is moving up the ladder for all the world, but there is still some work to be done, particularly in relation to areas that you can see identified here in terms of the SPCs. For implementation, that is putting policy into practice, a larger cohort responded that the PPN was at the information stage here than any of the previous stages. So almost a quarter of respondents said that felt that implementation of decisions was still at the information, the lowest level of participation stage. This is also reflected, as you can see in this graph here, in the responses by some of the stakeholder groups, with 2 in 5 of the other representatives, 28% of SPC respondents, 28% of the worker respondents, and almost 28% of the Secretariat selecting information only at this stage. Local authority staff respondents were again least likely to respond that the PPNs were informed of the implementation only after the event, with 11.5% responding in that way. So you can see again, there is a variation in terms of where these processes are at in terms of the levels of participation. But again, in looking at the dialogue stage, there is still a significant cohort that feel they're at least at the third of the 4 steps, that there is dialogue being engaged in. Monitoring then, similar to the previous stage, more than 1 in 5 felt that monitoring was very much at the information stage. So it appears that the more you progress through the stages of the decision-making process, the more likely you are to be at the lower end of the participation spectrum. So that in itself is valuable information to have, in that while there is an openness to the principles of participation, and there's certainly an openness to the initial stages, it isn't following all the way through, perhaps. And I'm very conscious of time and wanting to allow for questions and responses. When we look at reformulation, then again, we see very similar patterns emerging. So 3 in 10 PPN workers, SPC reps and LCDC respondents believe that information on reformulation was provided to the PPN by the local authority. So again, a very kind of low level of participation, rather than kind of looking at the partnership stage. We also asked representatives, and only representatives, the data from only the representatives is used in the report for this particular piece, because we wanted their view on where they get their mandate. So you'll see here, representatives could obviously pick more than one, because you can have your mandate from a range of different sources. So of the 132 representative respondents, you can see the breakdown in terms of where they're actually getting their mandate when they are representing the PPN. So it's great to see that the highest level are from linkage groups, so that linkage groups are working where they are established and where they can be connected with, which is great, because I know there can be difficulties in terms of engaging with linkage groups because of that additional time element. Their own experience would obviously be a factor, from the plenary, from the Secretariat, and then down kind of the visions for community well-being, because these are really only starting to be rolled out, and thematic networks. In terms then of results overall, public participation networks are engaging across a range of committees and boards at local level to influence policies that affect their member groups and their communities. While most respondents felt that the principles of participation were being adhered to, it is interesting to note that an exception was made for the principal statement relating to openness in the decision-making process. Overall, the responses to our survey indicate agreement or strong agreement that the principles outlined are being implemented when it comes to participation at local government level in Ireland. And similarly, a high proportion of respondents felt that the PPNs had moved beyond the information and consultation levels to the dialogue level for many of the stages of the decision-making process. There is still, however, some work to be done before partnership can be achieved at all stages in the decision-making process. It's positive to see that a high proportion of respondents felt that the level of participation across each stage of the decision-making process was at dialogue stage. However, there is still a significant proportion who responded that it's still at the lowest level and that the local authorities provide the information only to the PPN. This is particularly the case for PPN representatives and the SPCs and the LCDCs, two important committees which will benefit from a more inclusive approach to community participation. It's also clear from the respondents that there is variance among and between stakeholder groups as to the level of participation experienced. This is evident in the comments included by some respondents, and there was a comment section in the survey that was there to add some colour, to seek some more kind of depth in relation to the data that we were getting for this quantitative piece of research. And they're well worth reading because they are quite indicative. It provides both a challenge and an opportunity nationally. Examples of really good practice developed in one area may apply equally well to another, acknowledging that there are local variances necessary to ensure that participation is specific to the actual community or the local authority area concerned. So in terms then of the recommendations, and there are three key recommendations coming out of the data. So the first one is looking at some structural support in the form of dialogues. The disparity between and among respondent groups presents, as I say, a challenge and an opportunity for PPNs and local authorities to discuss what's working well in some areas or for some particular committees, and to develop best practice procedures in partnership. The mainly positive responses of the local authority staff respondents also present an opportunity to explore their approach to the principles and the levels of engagement with their stakeholder colleagues to come to a common understanding. This could take place at local or at national level under national oversight of the National PPN Advisory Group or of the department. This would also address that personality effect that some people talk about that makes participation dependent on individuals among various stakeholders rather than a more systemic approach. So our first recommendation would be a dialogue between local authorities and other PPN stakeholders to establish those practical best practice approaches to implementing the principles across all stages of the decision-making process. Our second recommendation then relates to policy. So the data presented indicates that local authority staff are both broadly in favour of participation generally and strongly of the view that their structures as currently constituted lead to high levels of partnership at all stages of the decision-making process. This isn't, however, shared by the majority of representatives. In addition to the dialogue that's referred, a review of participation within the local authority structures should be undertaken. So this review would focus on whether these structures are really participative, following the Council of Europe's framework that we've already discussed. So to support this review and the implementation of any actions, we're recommending that the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage should dedicate resources at least principal officer grade to work collaboratively with counterparts in the Department of Rural and Community Development to ensure that there is meaningful engagement between the two. Because as I think I've said before, and certainly in terms of when we talk about representatives training, you can't be a team player unless everybody on your team is playing. So it would really enhance that participation and that collaboration between stakeholders. And then our final recommendation then is to look at additional research. So we sought to quantify how selected PPN stakeholders applied the principles of participation across all the stages. the disparities that are identified between and among stakeholder groups in their application certainly warrants further qualitative research with respondents to this survey who indicated willingness to engage in further conversations on this topic. So our last recommendation would be to have further research based on qualitative interviews to explore best practice solutions. And with that, I will thank you very much and hand you back to Sean.
Thank you, Colette. And that's a very extensive and speedy journey through what in effect is a substantial report. As Colette mentioned already, the report is available on our website, socialjustice.ie, and it'll be sent out to everybody as well by email after this. So just to acknowledge that, I kind of want to say thanks to Colette at this stage for all the work that was involved in putting this together in the first place, and the fact that she was pointing out something that I think is very important, given that we're looking at these kinds of engagements now and so on. The sheer scale of involvement of local organizations in the whole process with local authorities and PPNs is very substantial. In fact, it's 15,599 local organizations in the annual report, the most recent annual report. And that's a huge amount of local organizations who have signed on an ongoing basis as part of the PPN and are engaged in this whole process. And as we saw, there's a plus side, if you like, on the framework and the principles: participation, trust, accountability and transparency and independence, the OECD framework principles, but some distance maybe to go in terms of the full implementation of that and the full rollout of it as well, and some challenges in that area. It's now my privilege to invite, so thanks Colette, okay, for that. So just my privilege now to invite Ciara Bates, the Principal Officer in the Department of Rural and Community Development, who is responsible for all of this and is responsible for PPNs, and it has an extremely detailed knowledge of what's going on in all of this across the country. I can attest to that myself. So I'm more than happy to invite her now to comment on the report. Over to you, Ciara.
Thank you very much, Sean. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. And I give the same warning as Colette did, but I'm actually locked. I've locked myself in the bedroom and locked the kids out. So if you hear any banging, that's them. But I left them with loads of food, so hopefully I'll be all right for a little while. Just to say thanks very much for that introduction, Sean. I think you flatter me a little bit, but I'll take it. Thanks very much. Colette, a really interesting presentation, and I think on a really useful piece of research that was conducted by yourself and Sean and the team in SJI. And I'd like to thank Social Justice Ireland for inviting me and the department to comment on the findings of the report. And as I said, thanks to you and Sean Colette for the work that you do on an ongoing basis to support the aims and objectives of the Public Participation Network. And we collaborate on a number of projects on PPNs, and Sean is also a representative on our National Advisory Group, and it's great to get those perspectives and insight, particularly ones that are built on such strong research that you conduct. I suppose just to follow on from what Minister O'Brien has said earlier on, and I'd like to echo the points that he has made. And I think it's very positive to see that the PPN participation is being actively encouraged by local authorities. And I also note the recommendations made in the report are geared towards providing avenues for dialogue and cooperation between stakeholders, and that these are ideas that will be taken on board in our future PPN planning as we go forward to look at how we can improve and support those structures going forward. I know from a number of the comments that have come up as Colette was presenting on the report, and the Minister was also speaking, that there's a huge interest in from the participants on the webinar here today on honing in on that best practice brief piece and figuring out where things are working well, why they're working well. And I think that speaks again very much to the commitment and the dedication of the PPN stakeholders in making this a successful process and having the deliberative democracy and reaching that partnership level that has been highlighted by the Council of Europe as the ultimate in citizen engagement. One of the report's recommendations is for further qualitative research to explore those best practice solutions. As I mentioned, that's very much reflected and asked for in the comments of the participants on the webinar. And I'm happy to confirm that this work is already underway. The department is commissioning a review of the PPN structures, and that will take place over the course of 2021. And part of what this review is planning to do is to look at best practice in PPNs and consider how this might be replicated across all PPN structures, again, taking on board the local nuances that exist in each local authority and PPN area. The structural view, it'll be an engagement-led root and branch review of the PPN structures. It's going to be carried out by an independent contractor, and like this report has done, it will also consider the broader structures within which the PPNs operate. As mentioned by Sean and the Minister and Colette, indeed, that the PPNs have developed over the past 5 years, and the kind of resources and supports needed have also inevitably developed and changed too to match those requirements and needs. I think most of you will be aware that as part of the PPN annual report process and template, we look and ask what are the recommendations, or what would you as stakeholders like to see in terms of the developing or supporting the PPNs in doing the work. We then try and change those recommendations on a year-on-year basis to our within our and show these and display these and look at these in our work program within the department. So this review again will help the department and the local authorities and the PPNs themselves to see what changes might be needed going forward. It also, as Colette says there, provides an opportunity and the basis to identify and replicate the many good initiatives and participation practices that we know are in place across the country. And I think that the fact that they are in place gave respondents the opportunity to tick those relevant boxes around dialogue and partnership. And it's, I think, again, the recommendation is that we need to delve deeper into why they gave those responses and what is happening in their particular areas to allow them to tick those boxes. We also note that there was a recent case study on PPNs, which is carried out by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And this also highlighted their many successes. They include PPN reps and their wide-ranging contributions to local government policy and decision-making. They're serving as vehicles for hundreds of consultations nationwide, and the training they provide to thousands of people in volunteer-run groups across the country. And the department genuinely commends the PPNs for these achievements, because it's not something that we as a department could reach into communities and do, and we're very much reliant on the PPNs, their volunteers and their members to deliver these supports and structures. We might set the policy, but the implementation piece is very much led on the ground. And I think it'd be interesting, I suppose the definition that we used was used for implementation in respect to this research. I'll be interested in hearing more on how we can maybe delve into that a bit more. What does implementation look like, or how do they think implementation is achieved? Because from our perspective, many of the schemes and programs that we run via the local authorities or the LCDCs, the local development companies, very much have a community group involvement, and we couldn't deliver them without that engagement on the ground. So I think that implementation piece is something that I very much picked up on as part of the report. Again, just want to mention, and the Minister mentioned already, because I think it's a really good example of what the PPNs can actually do. And that was their hugely successful role in the Community Call Initiative, which was set up in the local authority areas in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The work that the PPNs did as part of this initiative, and still continue to do, it has been phenomenal. It's They've served as information coordination hubs. They've had volunteer-run groups carrying out vital frontline work for vulnerable members of the community. And many PPNs also set up initiatives off their own bat to offer further supports and to direct the assistance, the very much needed assistance, into the right areas within their communities. You know, so the PPN member groups really were central in delivering these critical services on the ground and continue to do so on a daily basis. The PPNs have played a huge role in communicating back to the local authorities that experience on the ground, because they're the ones who are living and breathing it. As I mentioned, we might set the policies in government departments or local authorities, but it's really the community groups on the ground that deliver them. And from the PPN experience in the COVID-19 community call initiative, they were the ones that were identifying where gaps were. They were offering solutions and suggestions as how we could do better. I think the very positive feedback that I've gotten was that the PPNs have felt engaged, they felt listened to. And I think one of the key findings of the review, the draft review, the draft report that NESC is producing on the review of the Community Call Initiative, was how do we capture this positive process and maintain it going forward? And I think that, again, is reflected in the findings of the report. It's capturing the positive and bringing it forward to ensure more participation and engagement going forward as we try, I suppose, strive to meet that partnership plateau. I mentioned the structural review already, and I think the structural review will assess how the network has operated to date against the overall objectives, which were originally set out in the 2014 Working Group report on citizen engagement. As Sean and both Colette have mentioned, this is the report which recommended the initial establishment of the PPNs. As mentioned, it will also identify the opportunities for further strengthening the PPNs, and it will also make recommendations for building on existing strengths. It will highlight examples of best practice already in operation, and it will also look towards the European agenda in terms of the development of effective citizen engagement mechanisms, and to see if there's anything that we can learn from our colleagues in Europe in terms of enhancing participation across the country. The 2014 report were informed by the Council of Europe framework on which the report produced by SJI is based. And the structural review will again look at these areas when considering how we better support the PPNs to carry out their objective. It's important that the structures that we have in place for how citizens engage in issues that affect them and the communities, that they're fit for purpose, that they allow for beneficial and meaningful engagement to both local and national decision making. There's no point in us having structures in place that don't actually work, or only part work, or only part work for one particular group of stakeholders within the PPN structure and not the other. So, as I said, we need to review these structures, evaluate their effectiveness, and develop a roadmap for moving forward in partnership to ensure that we have meaningful and impactful participation that benefits all of our communities. With that in mind, this report from SJI is really coming at an ideal time, as the structural review will be starting this spring, and the data from this report will contribute positively to the review. The department also notes the overall high-level agreement that the Council of Europe's principles are being implemented, and that many PPNs and local authorities are operating at the dialogue level of participation, as pointed out by Colette. And we welcome this, as well as we think it's a really good building point. And we also need to look at the reasons why people weren't able to tick boxes higher up the scale, and see how we move them up the various different levels. We also note that a significant proportion believe the level of participation was at the lowest level, and I think this is very much reflected in the findings and the recommendations of the report that have been discussed in detail by Colette. As we know, as we heard from Colette, the recommendations really focus on dialogue, they focus on reviewing our structures, and they also focus on further qualitative research. To me, these recommendations really speak very much to, and to a large extent mirror, the Council of Europe's Code of Practice for Civil Participation in Decision-Making Process. They talk about the need for consultation, dialogue and partnership in progressing the aims and objectives of the PPNs. And this is very much reflected in the programme of work envisaged by the department for the PPNs going forward. And it's very much supported by the initiatives that we put in place in recent years. And I think this is overseen by the National Advisory Group that we have on PPNs, who we very much rely on to input into our work programme and our agenda, to tell us the experience on the ground and what we need to do to make the PPN model work in the best interests of all. I'm conscious of time here, Sean. I have a lot more to say, but I can sum up if you want. How am I doing?
Please do, because we're running out of time. We're supposed to be wrapping up in 11 minutes, and we've no time.
Okay. I'll finish up then. I'll just stroll through some notes here, I suppose. Just again to finish up, the views of the stakeholders who respond to the survey. As I said already, it gives us challenges and opportunities to see things from all perspectives, and it really shows the reality whereby we can be looking at the same picture but seeing many different things. That partnership can mean one thing to one person, but something different to the next. And even where it means the same thing, that people have different experiences by which they measure success. And these are very much influenced by how, in how they view and rate things. So I suppose in summing up, taking stock of these different views, finding out that they exist, provides us with the opportunity to use this data and knowledge to inform our policies and practices on participation in local decision making, to support more active engagement. And in reading the varied comments at the end, which Colette mentioned, and the comments were in relation to about how PPNs are operating in their areas. And it's interesting to note the different views, again, the different perspectives and the insights that reflect the different stages of the journey that individual PPNs are on. And one of the many takeaways from this report for me was seeing that there is an opportunity to take the experience of those that see cooperation and trust between the PPN and the local authority as building all the time, and mirroring this across all our PPN structures across the country. And the department looks forward to working with all the PPN stakeholders to support this in a partnership manner over the coming years. Again, just like to thank Sean and Colette and the team for the commitment and the work in undertaking this valuable piece of research, which will serve us all well, I think, as we continue to support the work of our PPNs and move forward to meet the vision set out by the Council of Europe. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Ciara, and thanks for responding to the report and your comments. I think some very insightful issues, and I think as well your acknowledgement that it'll all feed as part of the structure review, and that it's timely in that context is very good. And I think I like the idea that it's good to review on an ongoing basis. We'd certainly hold that ourselves, and there's always learning to be had once we can take a look at what's going on across the system, and there's bound to be good practices in some places that can be picked up in others, and weaknesses that can be strengthened up and dealt with in other situations, and so on. So anyway, thank you for the comments, and we look forward to working with the department as the structure review rolls out, and as the PPNs continue on their road, with all those nearly 16,000 organizations actually being involved in, as the Minister was emphasizing, in the actual current day-to-day reality of addressing policy at a local authority level, trying to deal with COVID and a whole lot of other stuff as well. So thank you, Ciara. Now we don't have an awful lot of time, but we better get to questions and answers. Now, Suzanne Rodgers, who's here with us from, it's also Social Justice Ireland team member, and she's going to give me a handout to make sure that I don't miss the questions or key questions in here. The interesting thing is there's an enormous amount of comments, far more than I would normally see in these kinds of webinars, but an awful lot of it is comment rather than questions. And I think when you see that, there's a very simple question. Well, simple to see, is there anything simple up here? But I think I know the answer, but I better ask it anyway. Let Colette answer it. Wondering how many of the high numbers of respondents are from the independently hosted PPNs. I don't think you gathered the data specifically on that.
I would have to go back and break down the data to have a look. Just I don't have, off the top of my head, to be honest, I just don't have the figure for you, but I could certainly root it out.
That's just Catherine McCabe was asking that question.
No,
there's another interesting question here, which actually goes, you know, when you had your decision, the one on the actual looking at that, Charles Stanley Smith is asking, why is the LCDC decision so low, given that LCDC must be made up of a greater number of private members, which include the PPN reps? Not the easiest question in the world.
It's not. No, I mean, and it's quite interesting in terms of the, you know, I came at the research, because everybody, obviously, if you're doing research, you have to acknowledge a level of research bias. I came at it thinking I would know what would come out of it. I'd know what the outcomes were, and I have to say I was really surprised by some of it. Some areas were a lot more positive than I expected, and others weren't. It's important to remember that the research was asking respondents their view. So perhaps it's just a matter of the fact that the respondents for the LCDCs, it was their view that is how they're being engaged with. In terms of looking at the questions, there's a lot, as Sean said, in terms of the comments, but looking at the Q&A section, if you can see that, Sean, there's a couple of questions in there. All right. Can I answer it?
Yes, absolutely.
Grant. And there's one in here for Ciara as well. She'd be delighted to know. So there's one question from an anonymous attendee. Why should any PPN rep receive their mandate from the Secretariat when the Secretariat is a flat committee and its function is purely administrative? We basically asked where they were getting it from, and we gave a list. Now, that list is based on our experience in working extensively with PPNs in terms of what we're told. That wasn't a values statement or a judgment statement. It was literally asking a question. You know, in terms of, it may be a case that as the administrative arm of the PPN, the Secretariat are engaging on behalf of the plenary, as opposed to giving their own view, but that's where the representative may be getting their part of their mandate. Catherine McCabe asks, how does the term deliberative democracy relate to this report, or how are you understanding that deliberative democracy is currently being delivered? We view deliberative democracy in terms of going beyond just representative democracy, where there's actual meaningful engagement between the citizens and the state. So in this case, between the civil groups and the PPNs and the local authorities and the decision-making bodies on which they sit. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about participation in deliberative democracy. It's that type of meaningful engagement. Rel wants to, sorry, how will we choose who we use in phase 2? Well, we did ask participants of this piece of research that to give us their contact details if they wanted to be contacted further. So we'll certainly start from there. We look at how representative that is, and we might we'll more than likely set out another call at that stage. Thank you, Bill. Mary O'Donoghue, there should be a county breakdown with regard to consultation, dialogue, partnership. Is it the same counties that are showing high examples or experiences? The reason we didn't go into county breakdowns is that, as you can see, some of the local authority areas are better represented than others. But as I said at the outset of my part of the presentation, we actually did remove them and look at the data and put them back in and look at the data to see if there was any significant shift, and there wasn't in terms of the outcomes of the overall outcomes in terms of either stakeholder group or overall groupings. So that wasn't the case, but absolutely I can understand that would have been a concern.
There's a question there for Ciara.
There certainly is.
Can you say a little bit more about the structural review process which is planned by the department? There's a question from Paul O'Donnell. Yeah, far away.
Yeah, so we're hoping to kick off the we went out to tender before Christmas for the consultancy, where we hope to evaluate the tenders received in the next week or two and appoint the winning bidder, who we will then hope will start work by the end of February. Again, conscious, and Colette and Sean will affirm this, due to the experience that we had in terms of the handbook, that we've allowed a huge amount of time for engagement and consultation and input, etc., given the importance, I suppose, of the structure review to the future roadmap for the PPNs. So there's a huge amount of time given out for that. So we're looking towards the end of the year. We're not committing to that because we want to make sure that everybody is given that time to engage. And if it's felt that more time is needed, that we can afford that time to get a useful document, I think, that everybody can stand behind and support going forward. We're hoping to run a webinar once we've appointed the winning bidder for PPN, to let them know what they can expect in terms of engagement on the PPN structure review as well, which I think would be useful for all stakeholders.
Thanks, Ciara. Suzanne, did you pick up any other questions, particularly in the chat that we were having a look at?
I think you were right. A lot of them were comments, and I suppose that there's one just in now, which was to say that the report is a very interesting piece of work, but it is a self-evaluation by the participants. And is there any plan to do a study of the actual impact of the PPN? I presume that would probably be included in the review of the PPNs.
Yeah, just that
Ciara wants to talk
would be
that.
That will go as part. That's going to be part of the structured review, obviously. To try, as I understand it. I'm right on that, Ciara, right?
You are, Sean. Yeah, exactly. I mean, part of the review will be seeing if the PPNs are doing what they were mandated to do, or set up to do. And again, part of that will be looking at that impact piece, which is a challenge in itself, given the nature of PPNs. And we try to do it, again, Colette and Sean, we tried to do it as part of the annual report process this year, to provide that impact piece. And it is something quite difficult to do. But hopefully the consultants that will win will have a really insightful way of how we can measure that impact, and see what we need to do going forward. But it is planned as part of the structure review.
No, I think
You're in trouble.
And I think that's it. That's all in terms of the.
There is a very good section.
We've lost Sean, I think.
To kind of take a look at the impacts that PPNs are actually having. You've lost me now as well, have you? Sorry about that.
No, you're back.
Doo-doo-doo.
Yeah, you're back.
Am I back on air?
Yeah.
I'm not frozen on my own screen, but I'm frozen. If I'm frozen, we have an issue. Are you okay?
Yeah. If you want to wrap up.
We're back again. Okay. Yeah, better wrap up before we have another sort of overpowered whatever. Just to make a special thank you to everybody who was actually part of today, to the Minister, Joe O'Brien, to Ciara Bates, Principal Officer. A special thank you to the team, to Colette Bennett, and in particular on the work that went in, which was Trojan to actually deliver this, and also to Suzanne and the rest of the team, and their engagement in rolling it, getting it to this point, and getting the today's launch up and at it as well. We will have, as we said already, there'll be an email going to you, which will have the actual report and other bits and pieces as well. And a special thank you to yourselves, the participants. I think it says a lot that there's still over 100 people actually on this call at this point, having had a high of, I think, about 100 and close to 150. So we've done very well, and I think people, the fact that people have stayed on says a lot about the report itself. So thanks to everybody involved, thanks to the department, thanks to the team in SJI, and thanks especially to all our participants. We'll be in touch soon, and no doubt we'll be in touch on this issue and related issues again in the not too distant future. Thank you, stay well, and take good care of each other. All the best. Bye-bye.